Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the reports last week of the EU setting out what it sees as the initial pathway on the way to arranging closer cooperation in the future. It's attracted a predictable but no less baffling response from the pro-Brexit media, especially the Daily Express. But it's also got lessons for rejoiners who may be at risk of falling for our own rhetoric in terms of wanting discussions around the single market especially. So in terms of what this news earlier this week was all about, the EU Commission has set out a series of conditions for the UK before they feel it's worthwhile working on further areas of cooperation. They are being described as demands, but when you look at them, all the Commission are really saying is, you signed certain agreements, you should honour those agreements. They're not saying we need to do anything different. They're not saying we haven't already... they're not saying you need to do this thing that you haven't already agreed to, or you must agree to this for us to agree to this, or anything like that. It includes things like making sure EU citizens living in Britain don't have to make separate application to get settled status after 5 years resident in the UK. We agreed to this. It's the law. The High Court have confirmed that this is the law. The so-called demands also require us to fully implement aspects of the Windsor Framework to manage trade between Britain and Northern Ireland as agreed. So although the Express headline, Brexiteer furious EU issues demands to Keir Starmer, is the sort of predictable sort of clickbait they were always going to go with, the outrage is fake. All the EU Commission is saying is, oh, you know that Brexit deal of Boris Johnson's you really like? Yeah? We'd like you to implement it. I mean, what have Brexiteers got to complain about? Implement the Brexit that their favourite blonde buffoon won his majority for and signed into both UK and international law to great fanfare. Of course, what they're actually complaining about is they thought they could sign up to whatever was necessary to get us out of the EU and then renege on all our promises. But people who want to make that argument are not serious people, and the majority of people in this or any country understand that you can't have close relationships with people around the world if you can't be trusted to keep your promises. But there is a side of this that rejoiners need to be mindful of as well. There's a bit of narrative building, which I've discussed before, that we should rejoin the single market and that because Labour are not doing so, they must be a Brexit party and they own every harm that continues to afflict the UK as a result of Brexit, because apparently we could join the single market tomorrow. Now, I've said, and I'll continue to say, I don't mind people talking about joining the single market in such, simple, almost childish terms, as if it were a serious prospect, even though it isn't. That is because we do need a national discussion about this, and the media aren't providing one. So the only way to get one is to put pressure on the government to answer some questions. Now, top of my list would be asking the new government why we don't have an economic impact assessment for Brexit. We know why the Tories blocked one, but if Labour want to be seen as economically responsible, shouldn't they make sure we have one? But although I'm happy enough for people to talk about joining the single market as if it were a simple political choice for now, we have to make sure we don't actually fall for it ourselves. Like, don't fall for your own hype, basically. The problem with thinking that a proposal is realistic, oh yeah, why don't they just join the single market? That would solve everything. When the government don't implement it, is people assume that if the government won't do this, what seems to be a simple thing, it must mean they're up to no good, and then trust in politics suffers. And we already have a catastrophic lack of trust in politics in this country that, if not repaired, risks the rise of populism. The events of the past few days should actually make us very careful about the way we help or hinder here. And if we look at what the EU Commission have said this last week, we have to understand that from the reversing Brexit point of view as well, Labour have been very clear. What they want is to work on lots of agreements with the EU, like the veterinary agreement is one of their top of the list. But, the security agreements, energy agreements, trade agreements, even some free movement agreements, just not quite the same ones as the EU are pushing at the moment. I've already said recently that what Labour are pursuing on trade is sort of better than trying to just join the single market. Not because the agreements themselves would be better than the single market, because, it's because it's possible, should we get some of these agreements with the EU, we would see tangible benefits within a few years. But if we just came out and said, we would like to negotiate entry to the single market, for which there's no legal mechanism, by the way. It's worth reminding people, there is actually no process to join the single market. There's a process to try and agree a customs union, but not join the single market. So we'd have to have an entirely new legal mechanism created just for us. And it would need the unanimous agreement of every single EU member state every single member of EFTA, as well as the EU Commission and a majority of the EU Parliament. You're talking 15 years at least of negotiations before we get anything. 15 years of crap Brexit trade with zero improvements, and it would all risk the following election. So actually a more likely trajectory is you'd have 4 years beginning these negotiations, followed by the Tories coming back and throwing it all in the bin again. Whereas Labour's plan would get us better access to the single market in the short and medium term, if they can get agreement, that's a huge if. And whether or not they get all the agreements they want, it still moves us into a closer position to join the single market proper in less or equal time than if we just tried to make the big step from the start. However, even Labour's proposals, which aren't enough for some wanting us to push for an immediate single market pathway, are being rebuffed by the EU. The EU Commission are saying they're not going to begin talks on anything until we've implemented what we already signed up to. Now, I don't know if that's exactly how it would pan out. It could well be that talks in some areas can progress whilst we're showing signs of implementing our agreements. It could be that the EU just don't want anything more agreed until we've complied with existing agreements. But talks maybe can overlap the implementation itself. But the point is that the EU Commission are essentially saying there should be no further agreements until we have kept our word from before. You know, if they're saying we need to prove our good faith for small agreements, we're really going to have to prove it for something big, like being allowed back into the single market, which would require a completely new, bespoke for us, legal mechanism which does not currently exist. Remember, the EU already have a good deal with the UK on trade. Boris Johnson and David Frost rolled over like puppies wanting their bellies rubbed during both the withdrawal agreement and trade and cooperation agreement talks. The Tories were acting in haste and the EU were going, oh, you're in a rush, are you? Okay, well, we'll just wait for you to give us everything we want. We are the ones who desperately need a better trade agreement, not the EU. Anti-Brexit people need to be mindful of that as much as pro-Brexit people. And so you might think, well, let's just implement our existing agreements and get on with it then. After all, that is not an unreasonable position for the EU to insist on. No, indeed. But it's also not easy to do because there's various reasons why we haven't fully implemented our end of the bargain so far. Some of it was performative politics, like, for example, not honouring our agreements with respect to EU citizens living in the UK or being difficult about access to fishing waters. These were deliberate acts of Tory sabotage to their own deal for the sake of appealing to a section of their support, which in the end they didn't do anyway. They voted Reform UK. Well done. Other aspects may be down to simple incompetence, like Boris Johnson's almost childish belief that the private sector would magic up the infrastructure needed to cope with his hard Brexit, such as the creation of more lorry rest stops or just training more lorry drivers. But some of the things not yet implemented have not been implemented because it's going to strangle already suffering supply lines. You know, like when Brexiteers ask, oh, where's all this doom and gloom you predicted about Brexit then? Well, there are essentially two responses. First, our trade has suffered a great deal. Ignoring it by looking at fiddle figures doesn't change that. Ignoring it by going, oh, no, we always used to have empty crates of fruit and veg in the supermarkets and food going off before you got it home. You know, pretending doesn't change that. But the second is, it's not as bad as it should be because we never actually implemented our exit from the customs union single market properly. We've never applied full customs or standards controls on imports. If we did, you would be seeing it. And that's the real hole in our borders, because there's a price to be paid for that. And smugglers are waltzing through that hole every day. The lack of proper customs controls costing the Treasury tens of billions of pounds a year in lost tax revenues, which is another oddity, by the way, when people talk about, oh, if we join the single market, not being in the single market is costing us this, it's costing the Treasury 40 billion a year. It's like, no, that's the customs union. The single market is a different thing. But, that would more than fill in the black hole the Tories left. We'd have change left over for even more spending. And the lack of proper standards controls means that we're importing dangerous products which are risking people's health and lives. Now, in theory, if we want to do that on imports, that's fine because that hurts us. That's no skin off the EU's nose under normal circumstances. This is something that just hurts us. But if we apply full customs and standards controls, we would collapse our supply chains almost completely because we do not have the staff or facilities to manage it whilst maintaining traffic flow. Catch 22. But there is one aspect of our poor import controls the EU is concerned about. Because of the unique arrangements we have regarding Northern Ireland, it creates a weakness with single market entry within Ireland. So to take account of our weak import controls, we need to make sure we're operating the Irish Sea trade border properly. But that means further hurting trade and potentially restarting political strife in Belfast. Labour want to discuss arrangements which would make the process of securing the Irish Sea trade border easier, such as the veterinary agreement. The EU appear to be saying, no, you implement the tougher regime first, then we'll talk about the other stuff. So sure, let's discuss the single market, but don't be fooled into thinking it's within any UK government's power to actually just go, oh yeah, we should do this thing, and it happens. It won't happen. It can't happen. The EU have just made it clear that Labour are going to struggle to even get talks going on smaller agreements. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.